There's always, when you get these big projects, and I've covered a few of them now, big promises about jobs, about the money it's going to generate. It's always very controversial. But that always relies on, as you've said now, councils talking to each other, the roads going into place, the railways going into place, house building going on, all the things that we know quite often don't happen in this country. Jonathan, aren't you just over-promising, way over-promising on this?
The analysis on the jobs and housing is clearly the Airport Commission's analysis rather than our own. That's not our promise. That's the analysis by the Commission, who've been paid handsomely to come up with a very detailed look at this. And we have to some extent rely on their figures. Now, if there are alternative views of whether they've got it right or wrong, that's absolutely up for debate. But we're not using our figures. We're not over-promising. This is the Commission's view on what is likely to happen.
But when you're showing kind of slides of, fantastic new town-looking places and better rail links and so on, I mean, that kind of stuff is very, very tricky to happen in this country, isn't it? And it also relies on people like TfL putting in those roads and Network Rail putting in those railways and connecting everybody up. And again, we've seen what problems Network Rail have had recently, and we've heard TfL talk about all the stress it's going to put on their roads.
So it fundamentally relies on two things. One is the southern rail access to Heathrow. It's the main one that the plan relies on, the one plan we've been talking about today. But obviously our bigger proposal relies on western rail access too. These are projects that, one of which is well advanced in its discussion, if not its actual building. And Network Rail are already well on with looking at southern rail access. These are things that are actually in discussion already. It's not as if we've proposed something totally new that nobody's ever heard of, and is looking rather outlandish and undeliverable. These are absolutely deliverable concepts.
Heather, you said you'd been talking to your neighbouring boroughs. What have they been saying?
We will be talking with our neighbouring boroughs. We've got meetings lined up. We've been talking to the GLA. It's obviously extremely early days. This is visioning work, which kicks off our West of the Borough plan. And we put it on the table to start discussion and debate. What we do see is that Heathrow is a massive economic driver. The southern rail access is a game changer for us, and we will be doing everything we can to see that that piece of infrastructure is delivered. And we see that we've got a crucial role to play in the whole wider debate around the housing, London's housing issue, because through putting in the southern rail access, we can deliver considerably more housing than we can possibly contemplate otherwise.
Tony, you used the phrase full buy-in with local authorities and so on. How often do you get full buy-in on big projects amongst councils, amongst the mayor, government and so on?
Well, you never get full buy-in, but what you get is, beyond a point, negotiations about what can be, frankly, got out of projects. And of course, up to the point where a government made a decision to go ahead with a project like this, everybody will adopt the positions they adopt. That's the time we're at now. If the government were to say, we're definitely going to do this, and the opposition said, we'll definitely back you up, everybody would then assume a different position. It's all about negotiating. You don't have to be Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Tsipras to see that you negotiate all the way through to the point when you either do or don't have an agreement. And then, if there were an agreement, everybody says, well, of course, now we move on. And then they'd all say, what can we get out of this? That's a very different world at that point. So there's a sort of difference between this world and the world that would occur if and when a decision were made finally to do it. And at that point, we've heard from Hounslow. Hounslow, I can say this broadly, has had a more nuanced and agnostic, if there's a sort of positively agnostic attitude. I think, is that fair? Better than that?
It's very clear that we're better, not bigger.
Better, not bigger, right, okay. But once the decision were made and Heathrow was going to grow, then all the local authorities roundabout would start to think, well, what can we get out of this, mitigate this, that and the other, and then it would change. But at that point, there does need to be some kind of mechanism for these decisions to be handled rationally. Otherwise, you just end up with an endless series of small negotiations when, lots of public authorities will think, and rightly, understandably, what can we get out of this? And that's the right thing to do for their residents, but that needs to be managed and made part of something bigger.
So do you have to force them to kind of work together rather than compete against each other, do you think?
Well, that's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. Because, Heathrow Airport Limited can't do this. It can do lots of things, but it can't do this. And then the question is, given that it's right on the London boundary and on the boundary of several local authorities, either somebody in public life takes the initiative or it doesn't happen. I mean, I mentioned the London Docklands Development Corporation. That was imposed by the Thatcher government on the GLC and the local boroughs. They didn't like it, but you have to say, you know, Canary Wharf is a different place today than the windswept place it was in 1980. The Olympics was slightly better than that, and actually, Old Oak Common, not so far away, I think will create an urban development corporation by agreement between the local authorities and the mayor. So, you know, it can be done better or worse, but in the end, a politician has to take the lead, and it has to be a fairly powerful politician, because only really they have the legitimacy. Or the alternative is you find some grandee and appoint them to do it, and then they use their clout to get it done.
Ian, we're talking about powerful politicians. I mean, we know about the current mayor we've got, but how important is the next one going to be?
And Zach.
I mean, that's an interesting point.
Who's
what
my
happens
MP?
if
Yes.
Zach gets elected?
Well, the thing is, this is an important thing, and I'll pick up something else if I may. The mayor's important in London. I think all of us who work in London would generally say the mayor does a good job, be it Ken or Boris. They've generally been pro-development. Some of us aren't happy with some things they've done, etc. But if you're promoting large-scale schemes, you've generally had a pro-development, pro-economic growth take on issues. It won't be Zach's call. It will have to be, I think Tony's right, it will have to be a national government call. And therein lies a tension now between Boris's stance and Zach's stance, etc., and the cabinet and the Prime Minister, as it were. It's interesting that the same Prime Minister, I think the Commission was commissioned in 2013, under the Cameron as a Prime Minister, and now he hasn't been that keen on the report, even though he was the one who asked for the report in the first place, which is an interesting take on it, which is, as it were. I think, just picking up the point, moving forward though, I think the real battleground won't be the delivery of the economic, and the Southern Access schemes is a great idea and will unlock huge swathes of southwest London and take the heat out of Paddington and other routes through. It's a housing issue. Most adjacent boroughs would want the jobs. Slough will want the jobs, as it were. When you say, actually, your share of that 48,000 is 5,000 on top of what you have to do anyway, and London's 49,000 doesn't include, if I remember correctly, doesn't include the Heathow growth factor on top of that, as it were. You say to Spelthorne, your take is 5,000 extra. That's, I'm not too sure it's 5, I think it's 3. And then they look over the hedge to Bracknell Forest, and I think you should take another 1,000 on top of that. And given that the average date of adopted local plans in that area is 2008, so there is very little up-to-date local plans in place. It will take another 7 to 10 years for them to get their act into order and agree who's taking what. If you leave it to a local plan process, the end result will be under delivery and under allocation of housing land, as it were. And we all know what effect that is. Those of us who own a house get richer on paper, but we just pay more for the next one. But it fundamentally undermines the economic well-being, I think, of London and the region, and undermines the delivery.
I think I'd have to disagree slightly with that. When you read the detail of the local economic impact report that the Commission have published, what they say is, and they're very clear, that the surrounding areas with their current planned housing growth are very capable of absorbing the jobs, the 70,000 jobs that are going to be created. That's the phrase used, very capable of absorbing it. That's for 3 reasons. One is that there's large, high unemployment around Heathrow. The second is that there's going to be a growth in the population, which that housing is designed to accommodate. And the third is that it's going to be spread across 38 boroughs. Because of Crossrail and other surface access interventions, it won't be all crowded onto the 14 boroughs that they originally assessed it on and came up with 70,000 houses. They're now saying it's very capable of being assumed into the current planning for housing.
It's not for me to ask the question. So are you saying the Commission's wrong that the net additional housing need is 48,000?
They themselves say it's not going to be 48,000.
Right.
They come up with a number, then say it won't be this because.
Right. So what is it?
0.
So no net additional housing from Heathow?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Jonathan, it's all about being a good neighbour, isn't it? Getting the councils on board and getting sceptical voters on board and so on. Heathrow's been very quiet about the conditions that Howard Davis has put on you getting this third runway, frankly. You've said you'll go away and look at it. When I interviewed John on the day itself and asked him about the night flights and all the rest of it, I got nothing back. I don't feel we've got anything back since. Are you backing off from some of those conditions?
So John gave you a clear answer yesterday, which is we've got a lot to read. And it's true, there's sort of 5,000 pages to wade through. We've just been seeing where some of that detail is buried. We've got to read the whole thing carefully. But I think you can take it as read that we want this project to go ahead.
So that means you will go, because it can't be like the first time he's ever heard those ideas. You know, I admit the detail wasn't quite there, but some of this stuff has been mooted, isn't it? We all know about air quality and noise and so on. They must have thought about it, but there's been nothing even along the lines of, yep, we're minded to do things like that. It's just been silence at the moment. When are we going to hear back?
Shortly, I think, is the best take.
Andrew Sharp, Business Travel News. The problem with the previous Southern Rail access was the issue of level crossing occupancy closer into London. Have we got a solution to that one yet, please?
Network Rail are looking at it at the moment. I'm not a technical specialist in this area, so it would be wrong for me to pontificate about it, but I believe they do have an answer to the issue.
Yes, Network Rail are thinking about a lot of things at the moment. So, any other questions from the... Yeah.
Jonathan Riley from Pinsent Masons, the Leeds office, so a question from the regions. It's a question for Ian. If we see an expanded Heathrow do the job that everybody hopes and connect with certainty over the long term with our regional airports, then land around those airports is going to be increasingly valuable, increasingly useful in the same way as land in Hounslow. Do you see a need for a top-down national planning policy change to make it easier to develop around regional airports?
We see as a practice regional airports as a major area of growth. I think airports are akin, not the same, but akin to the seaports that were in the 18th and 19th century. In today's world of localism, there's no appetite, in my view, for a national policy statement which goes so far as actually giving targets for each regional airport. I think each airport will have to make its case, as it were. It would be helpful, I think, to be a national policy statement on the ambitions for passenger movements and freight as well, and understanding about the relationship between flights and passenger movements as well. And I think that type of overarching evidence base, and I think that's where the Commission's report could be helpful. I think where we fall down at the moment is we end up at a local plan, as it were, and we're arguing quite complicated issues which the local authorities haven't got the evidence in place and can't get the evidence in place, as it were. So some form of national evidence base that deals with these issues and the knock-on effects, and I may disagree with Aircom about no need for new housing about the airport, as it were, but an agreed evidence base, I think, is probably fundamental. Otherwise, we won't get the infrastructure planned properly either.
Tony, does anyone lose out? Because we hear about all the gains. Are there parts of the country, or perhaps the council doesn't get its act together and they actually lose out?
Well, it's not quite my best topic. I mean, inevitably, if you did something different, somebody else might have gained something else. I mean, had Britain chosen, you're suggesting this, had Britain chosen to put its main runway capacity at some vast new runway and an imagined piece of open space, not that there is any, somewhere between London and Birmingham, that would have been a completely different solution. I mean, there isn't a fixed amount of civil aviation, there isn't about a fixed amount of economic output in the world. So it is quite possible for Heathrow and many airports in other parts of the country to grow together, in the way that all the cities of the UK grew together in the 19th century. So there isn't a fixed amount of growth. So, I mean, again, this is something that you might have thought, there was a degree of this in the campaigning about the airport, about Heathrow, trying to get airports outside London that felt they had something to gain out of London to work alongside, and that to some extent happened. But as not as much discussed as I thought there would be, is an alternative proposition for Britain was always to export all the growth to a hub airport somewhere else. Oddly enough, the government's can't quite bring itself to make that point. But there is a sort of, if we don't do anything, that would be the de facto policy that we would be pursuing, which is to say, well, increasingly people will fly from Leeds to Schiphol, not from other parts of Britain to the UK. If we do nothing, that will gradually happen. So it's not just Britain, but it's Britain versus the nearer parts of Europe and beyond, actually, all in a similar kind of market. But at some level, they can all grow together.
Okay, very quickly, I did this earlier, in like one sentence, is Heathrow going to happen? We've got the decision, is it going to happen? I know what I'll get from down that end, but I'll ask you anyway, starting with you, Heather.
Yes, I think it will.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen quickly.
Yeah.
Yes, but not in this Parliament.
Okay. Nice, crikey. That's a long wait.
Is that permission you're talking about, or
Government support. Government support.
government support?
Yeah. Tony.
Eventually.
On that note, thank you all very much. Thank you.